This is not a referendum. Russia is not really a democracy. But this is not a despot, and Russia's president is no dictator. Over the course of 20 years, Putin's image has evolved from grey man to strong man. In fact, he is neither. The truth is more complicated and more disturbing. I was in Russia in 1999 when then President Yeltsin picked an unknown former KGB officer to be his heir apparent. And back then, pretty much everyone said the same thing about him. They've picked him, they said, because he's a nobody, because they can control him. He'll never last. How wrong we all were. To understand who Putin is and what Russia has become, you need to go back to the 1980s. According to the official narrative, in the dying days of the Cold War, Dresden was a backwater, and Vladimir Putin, the young KGB officer, was stuck in a dead-end job. He's spoken of being bored and drinking a bit too much beer. But it's now emerging that quite the opposite was true. During Putin's time in Dresden, the KGB was busy smuggling new technology into the Soviet Union in defiance of Western sanctions, according to Catherine Belton, who spent 2 decades investigating their activities.
The KGB and the Stasi had to cook up all these front companies and fake contracts so that they could sort of sidestep the Western embargo and get these assets and technology across the wall.
Many years later, these were skills that would prove useful. But in the meantime, the communist bloc was crumbling and parts of the KGB were actively preparing for the collapse of the Soviet Union.
They were preparing the move to the market, but they also realized they needed to kind of start shifting assets so that they could preserve their intelligence networks even after a collapse of the communist regime.
When Boris Yeltsin saw off a coup attempt by hardliners, it looked like the power of the KGB had been broken. But in the decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russians saw the promise of Western freedoms evaporate into lawlessness and economic collapse.
How has it happened that life here has become so dreadful? I'm 63, but I'm praying to God that I die soon, so I won't have to suffer this torture anymore.
Their president was ailing, sometimes drunk in public. Behind the scenes, a handful of oligarchs who'd made billions out of the chaos of the transition to the free market were the ones really running the show. Yeltsin's replacement, then, had to be somebody who was young and healthy, acceptable to the oligarchs, and who didn't seem to pose a threat to Yeltsin's liberals. Someone who could be all things to all people, a blank slate.
He pretended to be a liberal, to be a Democrat.
Mikhail Kasyanov was Putin's first prime minister.
Boris Yeltsin and myself, we were absolutely sure, or at least we wanted to be sure, that Putin will continue same policy. Same policy means a more consistent policy and more active policy of building up a democratic state with a free market economy. That's why I accepted Putin's proposal to be a prime minister working with him.
I'll answer the question. I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward.
During his first term, he made a good impression on Western leaders too.
I was able to get a sense of his soul.
But while Putin was busy making friends abroad, at home he was neutralizing anyone who might present a challenge to his authority, starting with the oligarchs who'd helped put him in power.
The dramatic arrest of the richest man in Russia, Mikhail, seized at gunpoint by Russian special forces, reads like something out of an Ian Fleming novel.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky would spend 10 years in jail. ostensibly for tax evasion and theft, while Putin's allies dismantled his oil company Yukos and divvied up the spoils. It was a turning point.
I think it was the moment when they really sort of first tasted blood. They realised that they could take over the country's court system, that they could begin to pick off oligarchs one by one, that they were able to really kind of essentially assert their authority and begin to take over the economy.
But in the West, instead of shunning Russia for what was clearly a politically motivated prosecution, the opposite happened. International investors soon queued up for a piece of the action. Mikhail, now in exile in London, told me he believes that Putin took from that a key lesson, one that would influence much of what was to come.
Я полностью убежден, что он нашел подтверждение своему факту, что Запад покупаем. И, собственно говоря, та коррупция, которой Путин и его окружение пользуются внутри западных обществ на сегодняшний день, то есть когда он использует деньги, когда он использует возможности, когда он использует разного рода благоприятствования и, наоборот, угрозы для достижения своих целей внутри западных обществ, это, конечно, в том числе результат того, что вот он посмотрел на случай ЮКОСа, действует.
As Western investment flowed into Russia, attracted by rising oil prices, Russian money went the other way, much of it finding its way into the City of London, attracted by light touch regulation.
We were meant to be the city on a hill that represented the economist version of globalization and the future of the world, yeah? That Russia would become more integrated with the West through entering the London Stock Exchange and the London financial markets and the London property markets. And this was the great dream, that we'd all come together and slowly they would become more like us.
And they did, but not quite in the way that some had hoped. Leaks like the Panama Papers show the extent to which Putin and his associates have mastered the art of hiding vast amounts of cash in shell companies and offshore tax havens. A UK parliamentary report into Russian influence in British politics, completed in October last year, remains unpublished.
The Kremlin twist on this is very subtle, in the sense that they're like, yeah, we are going to become more like you, but you're a sham, yeah? All that human rights stuff, that was just a mask in order to launch your imperialist wars against us. All that stuff about kind of, democracy and free markets leading to more representation, all this kind of package of liberal democracy that you espouse is nonsense. Actually, it's just a mask for corruption, rapaciousness, greed, cynicism.
But this was about more than just kleptocracy.
Putin's men were taking over Russia's strategic cash flows, not purely just to enrich themselves, but also to have a stash of cash, a strategic slush fund, which they could eventually deploy against the West, that was buried already deep in Western markets, whether it be through front companies, the LLPs that have been so widely used in London, or whether it be through kind of Russian oligarchs who are certainly no longer oligarchs, but loyal vassals to Putin's Kremlin.
From the war in Ukraine to attempts to meddle in foreign elections, their methods are straight out of the old KGB playbook, the rules Putin learned in Dresden in the 1980s.
He is master of different provocations, of course, and pressure people, just buying people's loyalty, etc. Combination of all those factors. This all what just he was taught in KGB high school.
Those who have access to state funds can be called upon to use them in influence operations. The lines have become blurred between individual gain and what the Kremlin deems the national interest. I sometimes think it's helpful to see Putin not as an individual, but as the instrument through which power is exercised in Russia. So, in a country of weak institutions, Putin is, for good or for ill, an institution that is strong and that works. And for a small group of people around him, he allows them to maintain their power and wealth. But for many, many ordinary Russians, whether they like him or not, Putin is essentially all they've got. There is no doubt about the outcome of this referendum. In Russia's democratic simulacrum, you can vote how you like, but the result is always Putin.
Путин поместил страну в ситуацию, когда ничего, кроме нелегитимного нормотворчества самого Кремля, не существует. А это нелегитимное нормотворчество, оно говорит, пока мы сильные, вы не можете поменять власть. Какой, к сожалению, из этого вывод? Поменять власть можно только силой.
Over the past 20 years, Putin and his former KGB associates have agreed a tacit bargain with the Russian people. You get a strong state, we get rich. You lose some freedoms, but you gain some stability. It is perhaps an understandable deal, given all that Russia has been through. But the trouble with a strong man is this: he's stable until suddenly he's not.